This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Business, history, and culture with a nautical twist. Today, I'm in conversation with the entrepreneur and religious scholar Jonathan Teubner. Jonathan Teubner is the founder and CEO of Filter Labs, an AI company that transforms hard-to-reach data into insights that drive strategic decision-making and shapes global narratives. He is also currently research faculty at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. Teubner's research and publications have examined the intersection of Christian thought and practice with theories of religion and violence, economics, technology, and secularism. His first book is entitled Prayer After Augustine, a study in the development of the Latin tradition, and the follow-up volume, Charity After Augustine, Solidarity, Conflict, and the Practices of Charity in the Latin West, which will be published by the Oxford University Press in December 2024. Teubner is an expert in religious life in Imperial Germany, with a focus on the influential theologian Adolf von Harnack. He has taught at the University of Virginia and Australian Catholic University. He has a PhD from the University of Cambridge, a master's degree from Yale University, and a bachelor's degree from Oklahoma State University. Jonathan, welcome to Wet Lunch in the High Seas, and thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Stephen.
So your focus is on Imperial German society and the role of religion. And there was a lot going on in Germany between the unification of the country by Bismarck in 1871 and 1914. This is an area that we have both studied in your religious work and also in my research in The Last Ships from Hamburg, which focuses heavily on Imperial Germany and its growing shipping business and global reach. One of the people at the center of theological life in Imperial Germany is Carl Gustav Adolf von Harnack. Could you please discuss his influence in Imperial Germany? And this was a time when Germany was, its universities and its scientific thought was at the forefront of the world. And in fact, American universities such as Johns Hopkins were modeling themselves not on the British model like Oxford and Cambridge, but on the German model in which graduate studies and research came first and the undergraduate experience was a distant second. Could you talk about how Adolf von Harnack's work fit into this new Imperial Germany?
Yeah, thanks. Harnack is this entirely fascinating character, at least to me, in his role within a very complex German culture in the late 19th, early 20th century, particularly. He's raised in East Prussia, in modern-day Estonia, largely, among a lot of Russian speakers, but he very much identified as being German. His father was one of the preeminent German theologians for a very traditional variety called Lutheran Orthodoxy. Harnack grows up in this culture of a member of the German professorship. His father was a significant churchman as well. And so he grows up being very comfortable with two key institutions in Imperial Germany: the Protestant church and the university. And particularly for someone in the discipline of theology, those are very much intermingled. And so how he kind of moves through a lot of the crises that are going on around him are sometimes seemingly unexposed to so much of it there until the kind of later period of Wilhelmine Germany and the run up to World War I, which is a very fascinating kind of story about Harnack's place there. But as a figure like Harnack would kind of understand Germany here, was he definitely knew about things like the Kulturkampf and knew people who were involved in that. But he largely stayed on the sidelines of that. He was not a major figure in any of those. He was, in any case, very young at that point. But he comes up and slowly, kind of moves from chair to chair, eventually ending up in Berlin. And it's at that point he becomes a public figure. And part of it is how he gets appointed in Berlin. It's kind of a controversy. And it was, and this is really how he comes to the attention of Kaiser Wilhelm II here, was that his appointment to the chair of church history at the University of Berlin, which is the preeminent chair still to this day in church history in Germany, was needed to be supported both by the academy and by his colleagues at the university, as well as church leadership. His colleagues at the university overwhelmingly supported his appointment, with some reservations or qualifications that they had for him. But it was really on the church side that they had grave reservations and blocked his appointment there. And that was because he was considered very liberal, progressive on many issues. For example, the issue of the virgin birth, which he denied was a historical event. And obviously that would cause a lot of tension with a very traditional form of Lutheranism, like his own father's there. And the Kaiser steps in to really seal the appointment for Harnack, not because he's really a great supporter of Harnack, and at that point, because Harnack is very powerful, but it was really the Kaiser stepping in to put the church in its place, to say that the Kaiser is going to be in charge of this. It's the Kaiser's understanding of all these institutions. And really at that point, Harnack becomes a very major figure in it, even to such an extent when he is invited, along with Max Weber and another German sociologist, theologian, Ernst Troeltsch, to the United States. He's the main act. Everyone's coming to see him in St. Louis at the World's Fair. And he's making this big tour of America, lecturing in Chicago. Here in Cambridge at Harvard, he was offered appointments and chairs at Harvard on multiple occasions. And this was representative of what you just mentioned there about like the ascendancy of the German Academy. And to many respects, Harnack was a major figure at that point when the German Academy was at its strongest, particularly in the United States.
I mean, there's a lot going on in religious thought at this time. You have Christian socialism, you have William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, kind of this reaction against industrialized society in England. You have Unitarians in places like Harvard. The Unitarians have always been pretty progressive. And in Germany, you have this weird and often nasty conflict between, you have a Protestant state, Prussia, and the unified German Empire is a mixture of Protestant and Catholic. And, 300 years earlier, there had been a war that had killed half the population about this. And all of a sudden, they all speak a similar language, or they're all crunched together under the Hohenzollern rule. Where does Harnack's theology fit into this mix of what's going on with Christianity? Because you have a lot of it as a reaction against industrial society, and Germany is at the forefront of this, along with Great Britain.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that is hard to answer in very clear terms. And as the German Lutheran landscape really gets traditionally divided up in Germany at this time, there are three major camps. There's the Orthodox camp, that's the traditionalists, like Adolf von Harnack's father, Theodosius Harnack. And then there's the Pietists. This is a tradition of much more kind of interior religion about kind of that wanted to have a much more affective form of piety there. And then the third camp is one that started to emerge really in the 19th century, and that's the liberals. And so a lot of people are they very quickly want to put Harnack as a German Protestant liberal. But really he takes a lot from all of them, and he's very confusing for people to locate him on this spectrum here. And there's a couple of things that he's definitely very skeptical towards Catholicism there, particularly in his early work. And that's that's indicative of a general Lutheran Orthodox attitude towards it. But he's also starting to make arguments about Christianity being this spiritual religion, this interior religion there, that wanting to boil it down to some spiritual essentials, which would have been a little bit more, provided that he didn't go over into heterodoxy, would have been much more conducive to the pietists. And then, like with the liberals, he's denying some pretty significant features of the faith as well. So it's hard to map there. And to some extent, and because he's really not fitting in one camp or another very squarely, he kind of gets everyone paying attention to him all at the same time, because they're all kind of trying to see whether he's one of them. And each turn, they're always disappointed in it. And to some extent, his academic career is moving from someone who's very much engaged in the theological debates of late 19th century Germany into one who's much more of a cultural figure, talking about the place of science. He becomes the secretary of the state library, and he's running. He's very significant at the Academy of Sciences there, and he in the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, which is the forerunner to the Max Planck Society. He's the founding director, and he's the significant figure there. And so he kind of moves in that direction, and he kind of like, his theological location was less significant later in his life when he was trying to manage the university as Großbetrieb, or like big business. University is big business. Is something around the time where like Harnack was the figure trying to innovate how you might manage large multi-institutional programs and manage international influence of these programs and scholarship.
It's interesting. There's this constant theme I see in German history of Kaiser Wilhelm II sticking his finger into things that are often not. He claims to have a lot of expertise in certain areas, whether it's shipping or diplomacy, and I guess you get mixed results, to say the very least. I mean, where does the Kaiser stand religiously? I mean, I know that artistically and politically he was an arch conservative who was always trying to flex his muscles. He deeply resented his own mother, his own British-born mother, for being a liberal. Where does he stand in all of this?
As best people can really tell about him, he was for the Protestant establishment supporting his imperial regime. And so insofar that the church was kind of a nuisance there, it was problematic. And so this is where a figure like Harnack, who seemed very comfortable with the imperial authority and power in the way that the German Lutheran Church had kind of this cultural presence within Kaiser Wilhelm II's imperium there. And so, the Kaiser doesn't get involved in a lot of controversies, whether it's the controversy over the Apostles' Creed, which like exploded at a certain point in time over its authenticity, or over the stuff on virgin birth and stuff like that. So he very much wants that. He also appreciates certain aspects of the German church establishment, and this goes back to your earlier question that you just asked about these kind of new trends of like a rising socialism and kind of Christianity as a kind of social gospel movement, in the sense that we think about it with Walter Walschenbusch here, an American who studied with Harnack and kind of really was the fountain of American social gospel movement. And he's much more friendly to people who kind of like want to find a place in the overarching like church for some of these voices, but really doesn't let them dominate in a sense. And that's kind of Harnack's view of the social gospel as well, that he thinks is an authentic kind of articulation of some of the values of Jesus, but he doesn't necessarily want that to become like the sole focus of the church there and to turn it into an overtly political program. Harnack was always wanting to push back on that Christianity was an interior phenomenon. Obviously, there's problems with that, and there's limitations that we kind of see when the church, particularly in Germany, gets defanged a little bit from pushing back against the political establishment when it turns quite vicious and decadent in the Third Reich there. So the Kaiser likes someone of that variety.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you look at like what's going on in England with Christian socialism and the church, certain movements become extremely politicized. We need to create a better society on earth. And there's often this feeling that, well, the government isn't necessarily on the side of, righteousness. But it seems that what Harnack says is that Christianity, your faith, is an interior thing. It's something you battle with internally. But when it comes to dealing with the state, one must obey the state because you cannot mix the two. Is that about right? And can you expand upon that?
So to some extent, Harnack makes Christianity this interior thing that can then fit with many different social systems. I mean, Harnack himself had views about ones he favored over the other, but Christianity as a religion was an interior religion. And that is a move that he sees first really like bringing to the fore this emphasis. Augustine, the 4th and 5th century bishop from North Africa, and Augustine and then later Luther become very important figures for Harnack for articulating an interior religion. He wants that, and then he basically leaves it as that Christianity really shouldn't have too much at stake or to say in the political structures themselves. And such that the social gospel movement, he's fine as that informs my individual ethical relations with each other and the way I might orient to the poor or the way I might orient myself to broader political movements. But Christianity itself is not going to structure those. He doesn't see that role for the faith.
Got it. And this is also a time between 1871 and 1914 where there is much more cultural interplay between Germany and the United States. Let's turn our attention to this side of the pond. We often think of the special relationship between Great Britain and the United States, but thanks to the revolutions of the 1840s, there was a huge migration of Germans, Christian and Jewish, to the United States, and German culture was very strong here in Philadelphia and St. Louis. And Harnack went on these tours that drew these enormous crowds. And this was sort of after 1917, when America entered World War I. A lot of German Americans basically had to suppress their German identity. But during the Gilded Age, there was nothing seen as wrong with being culturally German, whether you were Christian or Jewish. A lot of these Jewish banking families hired German nannies. They were religiously Jewish, but culturally German. And there's not that conflict. Could you sort of explain why, Harnack's role in that sort of transatlantic cultural exchange?
As you and your listeners will know very well, the cultural presence of Germans in America really was kind of expanding quite rapidly throughout the 19th century. And one of the avenues for that German presence in America were Lutheran churches, in the upper Midwest, in St. Louis, even down to where I grew up in Oklahoma. There's a presence of Germans around. And so Harnack comes onto the scene as a lot of these German priests and pastors in America would have read and knew about his father, would have read his big textbook, The History of Dogma, which was until like maybe a few decades ago was still the dominant textbook out there about the history of Christian thought. And so they're very familiar with him And particularly at this point, when there was this kind of awakening of faith in the later decades of the 19th century in America, you have this hyper awareness, particularly among the Germans in America, to these leading church figures. And probably the event that really cemented his influence, both in Germany as well in the United States, was his very influential set of lectures on the essence of Christianity, Das Wesen des Christentums. It got translated into English with the title, What is Christianity? And that comes out in 1901 and just is this blockbuster book that's sold, and it's one of the most widely read books around Europe and in America. And it's really on the heels of that he gets invited to headline or be one of the headliners of the 1904 World Fair in St. Louis. And it's that, or I mentioned earlier, that there's crowds of people coming to hear him. And his junior colleague who came with him, who is much better known now, Max Weber, wrote to his wife complaining about the crowds coming to see Harnack and saying that his crowds were relatively meager to Harnack's there. And it's at this point you also see Harnack kind of shifting from being really squarely a German historian or church historian there to being a much more public figure, and one that, so in the first decade and a half in the United States, is this leading figure that a lot of German Americans are reading and looking to and understanding. And so much so that in the run-up to the war, he's kind of seen as a cultural emissary, not only to the cultural world writ large, but also specifically to the American community. And he gives this very kind of impassioned speech at one point that's very ingratiating to Americans on August 11th, 1914. Just days afterwards, like this German-American sympathy rally. He comes and dresses and talks about the natural sympathies between the two countries and how they've shared a lot, and the aspects of American culture that he appreciated on his trip there, the great hospitality and other things. But it's also in this context, it's important to keep in mind what he did and didn't say. He's pointing out things like America now has some of the leading institutions like Harvard and Yale there, but he's not saying so much about the general cultural presence of America. I think he kind of still thought America's elites were okay, but like when it kind of mixed in with regular Americans, they weren't exactly the cultural interlocutors he was looking for.
Yeah, it's just interesting you highlighting this like symbiosis. And it seems also in the business sphere, looking at the development of America during the Gilded Age, you had two pools of capital that were flooding into the United States. You had British capital through Barings Bank and also through JP Morgan. And then you have Central European capital, German capital flooding in through such institutions as Kuhn Loeb and Company. So it's not only just in the cultural sphere you have these two competing relationships, but in the financial sphere. And you could argue that in many ways World War I was as much a business war as it was a cultural war. Which pot of capital, which cultural mindset got supremacy in America? And America was a debtor nation up until World War I. And then after England and France and Germany financially imploded due to the war, America was holding all the notes. And America had chosen Great Britain. And there was this strange irony that during the early years of the war, before America entered, William Randolph Hearst was sort of whipping up populist fervor, but he was pro-German. And he had two groups of people that were among his readers who were for this. One, I mean, aside from the German Americans, one were the Irish Americans who hated all things English. And then you had Russian Jews who hated the Tsar. So you had also this competing newscape too. But when we turning to the war, one of the things that Adolf von Harnack is most known for today is that he wrote the address that Kaiser Wilhelm II gave justifying the war. I believe was October of 1914. He also affixed his name to the Manifesto of the 93, which was a collection of very prominent German theologians, scientists, artists who defended Germany. And this is just after Germany had marched into Belgium and there was this international outcry. I mean, it started off as Otto von Bismarck said, it started off as some stupid mess of the Balkans, and then it just spread. But can you talk about the context for the speech? I mean, there's a recording of it on YouTube. I've heard it, and Kaiser Wilhelm II is sounding as, typical bombast. But what is the context of the speech, and what exactly does he say? What does Harnack say to the Kaiser?
Harnack at this point, it's 1914. He was just ennobled there. He had, over the last several years, taking a leading role in the University of Berlin. He was a major figure in the German Academy, perhaps one of the most prominent figures during that time. So he starts to put in the Kaiser's mouth a phrase that doesn't naturally come out of the Kaiser, and to talk about the moral case for the war, to thinking about this in those terms, is something Harnack is probably rightly credited with doing here. His view on the whole is not it, is not particularly informed by like a kind of a highly rarefied Christian theology or anything like that. And also, it's worth saying, the Manifesto of the 93, there were 93 people, significant people, including people like Max Planck, who signed the support here. And Harnack also wrote this letter to the appeal to the culture, to the civilized world there. And what he was saying was that he believed this idea that Germany had been encroached, that its ability to expand had been limited there, and such that it felt threatened, and so its response was a one that was justified there. Obviously, in hindsight, and even during that day, there were people who didn't really buy that argument, to say the least. But he was starting to articulate that there, and I think he really thought that these appeals about talking about the moral case for the war, trying to reach out to his colleagues in the universities in the UK particularly, he thought that it was going to work there. And so one thing that I think is sometimes people project onto Harnack is some kind of like cynicism there. Harnack's not a cynical guy. I mean, that's not what he's done. He's certainly kind of found his way to the top of the pile in German academia, and that certainly wasn't without some kind of cunning from time to time, but that wasn't a feature of this, I'm going to go out and write the Kaiser speeches so I can get ahead. He actually thought that there was this moral case for the war, and that Germany, as this important carrier of civilization and German civilization, needed to be protected, and also needed space to expand to some extent as well.
No, I think a lot of it's interesting. A lot of cultural figures who we see as geniuses today, whether Max Planck or I was reading about how Arnold Schoenberg. I mean, he was Austrian. Even though he was an avant-garde composer, he was a deep, deep believer in German culture. I think there's some of these arrangements that he and his musician buddies made of Strauss waltzes to play during the war with reduced musical forces, just to keep them buoy their spirits. But yeah, I think on the other side, you did have people who were very worried about Germany getting involved, let alone a one front war, a two front war, with the
Yeah.
Russia on one side and France and England on the other. But I look at the main character of my book, Albert Ballin, who is in the business sphere. He felt that England and Germany should be competing in the business sphere, but culturally should be compatible. And he worked extremely hard behind the scenes using his very powerful connections, including First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, to stop a war. Of course, his main
Hmm.
fear was that shipping routes and the immigrant trade would be disrupted. But where does the business sphere fit into this universe? You talked about pillars of German society, the church, the state, the military. Business was a relatively new thing. Industry, especially in manufacturing cities like Dusseldorf and Cologne, the Ruhr Valley. But you also had this very strong agricultural pull in Prussia. And Germany was also starting to create an empire, much to Bismarck's chagrin, but shipping was a key part of that, plus trade relations with the United States and England. Where does business fit into this whole mix? And also, Vallon was a cosmopolitan and a Jew and a someone who was a deeply committed German patriot, but he was terrified of Germany becoming militaristic. Where does this current, the business cosmopolitan side, fit into this equation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not the best to answer. I think I've learned quite a lot from you on this front here. But I guess the way that if you think about it from some of the people I know and kind of have studied, particularly those in like high cultural figures, particularly from kind of elite pockets of like Protestant Germany, is that they didn't always like pay much attention to it to some extent, and they kind of thought that they were, to some extent, you see these expressions of German industry in it, and they were proud of it. They were proud of these figures who were to go on to be titans of industry, we might say, here. And they, as those people became very wealthy and established, they found their way into a cultural elite too. But their movement into the cultural elite often was by kind of learning the language and the mores of um, high culture in Germany, and such that when you're a figure like Harnack, who basically kind of comes up and remains in that, he doesn't really spend a lot of time worrying about that. That also, but on the other side, like he doesn't like the nasty edge of that, where someone in industry would probably feel much more viscerally on day in and day out the like anti-Semitism of the culture. Once you get to be a part of the university, particularly, there's no doubt to anti-Semitism there, but the conversation moves in a very different way. And I guess the way that I kind of have increasingly seen German society is a highly polarized, or at least distinct spheres there. Whereas like once you're in the university, there's some crossover with the church, there's some crossover with certain other cultural institutions, but those become kind of very thickly siloed. And they know of the benefit of German industry, but they're not going to have much to do with it. Just like a lot of leading figures in industry didn't go to university at this time. And that is just like that wouldn't be what they spent their time. And to some extent, it's very similar to a 19th century Britain, where the leading people of industry weren't university men. A lot of times, they were people who grew up and were successful entrepreneurs and went and did that for their life. And the clerics and the other intellectuals at Oxford and Cambridge and the upcoming London universities, that was a different sphere altogether. And even the royal family in Britain wasn't really a family of the university until King Charles, really. And that was, kind of a strange new occurrence for their family becoming strangely middle class in some sense. And so that similar dynamic existed there where they knew of each other, they were proud of each other, they would brag about each other at these public events, particularly in foreign countries, but they didn't have much to do with each other, particularly on a day-to-day basis.
You mentioned Parnak talking about Germany's feeling encroached upon and its right to expand. And he was one of the leading experts in Protestant Germany of Russian religion, of Eastern Orthodoxy. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he saw sort of a clash going on here, like because Germany and Russia were big time rivals. Of course, the royal families were closely related, but I get the sense that the Prussian aristocracy and really was hoping to expand their land holdings. Of course, there was the province of Poland, the Russian province of Poland, which was sort of this, this poor province that had been picked apart and divided multiple times. But what did Harnack see with Eastern Orthodoxy versus German identity and Lutheranism?
Yeah, so he has this famous distinction, somewhat infamous too, that doesn't really hold up, but one that he really kind of how he saw the world. He saw things, there was something called a spiritual religion. And that was a religion that sought to cultivate the interior person there. And that was one that Harnack associated with from Augustine to Luther to contemporary to himself as someone articulating the pinnacle of spiritual religion in his work Das Wesen des Christentums. What's that's opposed to what he's kind of saying, this is spiritualism, is something called a natural religion. And he thinks of a natural religion as that which is highly dependent upon ritual, highly dependent upon kind of thinking about the relationship with these kind of natural rhythms of the year as well, which a lot of religious rituals are, they move with the seasons of the year as well. So Eastern Orthodoxy was for him a natural religion, was very important. He didn't think it was anything but Christian in some sense, but it wasn't the fulfillment of it, that they still needed to develop to become a spiritual religion. And so this is kind of like the framework he develops throughout his life. This is very likely informed by his early childhood when he lived there in East Prussia as a German-speaking member of a certain kind of elite in Germany. His father was professor of theology and held very significant leadership roles in large churches as leading pastor. He would have been in this culture as well, where there was a majority Russian-speaking community too. And he would have known of himself as some kind of stranger here in this world, even though the Prussian elites here were at the helm of a lot of institutions. They were still a minority. And Harnack himself, I think for a while it was thought that he didn't know Russian, but actually there's good evidence that he picked it up and was one of the leading figures of understanding and reading literature coming out of Russia, particularly religious literature. So he probably knew more about Russian Orthodoxy than anyone else in Germany at this point, or German speaker at this point. That's not saying an awful lot, to be sure, there. And like how he articulates this, and it's kind of about like these unrefined Slav and Slavic culture. It makes you certainly uneasy about how he's, we might say, in today's terms, othering these people in very clear ways. So that's to some extent how he kind of starts to develop this like categories of spiritual versus natural religion there. And one that really does shape the way he views those cultures that weren't in this progressive, enlightened Protestantism. There, whether that was Eastern Orthodoxy, he has negative things to say about Catholicism, even though there's a much more qualified negativity to Catholicism. He just thinks it hasn't been fully developed, that it needs to accept all of the wonderful developments of the German Reformation there. And so that also becomes the basis for why he thinks countries like the US, the Netherlands, the Great Britain are natural cultural allies of Germany, because all of these countries are also sharing in this spiritual religion that come out of the Reformation.
No, that's very interesting and very the way you describe him both as an outsider where he grew up. Well, he was part of an elite where he grew up, but he always felt kind of, I guess you could say, outnumbered. How that sort of might have shaped his idea of like Germany needing to defend this ethic. And, as we all know, East Prussia / Poland has been like a battleground for a very long time. And, of course, we all know how this terrible war ends, millions dead, Germany defeated. And Harnack does something very interesting. He pivots and helps write the new constitution for a democratic republic of Germany, which I'm sure to a lot of foreign monarchists must have been like a betrayal, but he makes that pivot. He basically thinks, you know what, the old order is over. We need to pivot to this new form of constitutional governance, of a republic of representative government. And could you go into that? I mean, that's a pretty amazing pivot from someone who writes that speech in 1914 to saying, you know what, different times, we need to adjust. I remember reading Max Warburg's eulogy of Albert Ballin in November of 1918, where he essentially says the same thing. Like, we all believed in one thing, and now after this disaster, we need to pivot to something new.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable how strong the pivot was in this case, going from like writing the Kaiser's speeches to drafting, or being part of the drafting of the Constitution, of the Weimar Constitution. And it was certainly remarked upon by his contemporaries, that Harnack was very able to like shift from like serving in one imperium to being a central figure in the other. And he was thought to be a political survivor in a sense that was condescending and negative. But what he does in his role, particularly in the drafting of the Weimar Constitution, because it's this point the socialists are really ascendant there. And what they want to do is they want to do a couple of things. They really want to get rid of some of these organs of German traditional, like aristocratic influence. And one of them is the role of religion. And so when he's credited, and I think this is accurate, that of retaining a place for the instruction of clergy at state universities in Germany that still exist today. You can still go to the, Humboldt University in Berlin and, take a degree in theology, and out of that get ordained into the church. I think last time I looked, I asked anyone about whether this was something there was like two there. I mean, out of all the students that were studying theology, most of them will go on to teach theology or religion in the school system. Only two wanted to be ministers there. But but that system held together because of Harnack's insistence to keep it there. So he does make peace with democracy. He does make peace with a much more secular form of Germany, but he does it while also exerting some influence of religion and some of these more traditional structures within that, and securing a place for that in this. And this, I mean, Harnack's not the only part of the story of how a kind of German democratic order does start to emerge at this point. Obviously, very fragile, and it had a catastrophic and very violent collapse in the 30s into the 40s there, but how it kind of like retains some forms of traditionalism within it. It still has a very federalist structure to it in a way that a country like France doesn't there. And, Germany is retaining a place for religion around the time where laicite in France is really starting to take hold and becoming a more dominant, like very strong separation of church and state in France. Germany keeps them together. And that's a little bit about the difficulty of understanding Germany in the 20th century is it doesn't really map so cleanly on to any of our, like, England as retaining it, like a real strong, like the Queen as the governor of the church, as the head of state, or a French or an American model of separation. They're kind of this muddled mixture of it. And to some extent, that's part of why it got itself into this terrible mess and, committed these atrocities, but also part of why it's kind of retained this difference from a lot of other European powers throughout the second half of the 20th century.
Well, I mean, Harnack dies in 1930, 3 years before Hitler comes to power. Can you sort of talk about, on one hand, he helped turn Germany into a constitutional republic, but you also have hinted that his idea that religion should not play an active or even combative role in politics, that also might have tragically paved the way for the Third Reich. Can you sort of talk about that duality?
Yeah, I think that's actually really important to understand, not only about Harnack, but something about like some of the intrinsic vulnerabilities within the German system here that are much more like cultural, or we might say spiritual to some extent, that I think are sometimes underappreciated in the histories of Germany in the 20th century. So on the one hand, he does come to terms with this constitutional order there, and he finds a way and kind of reaches back and basically says that, like, this religion that is spiritual, that is forming the ethical agent of a society, should be retained. That we still want our clergy to be promoting this, and particularly teaching Harnack's version of Lutheranism or Christianity. So taking someone's faith and trying to like turn it like into an interior space, something that we might call private religion in our contemporary discourse. I mentioned this a bit ago, was it defangs the Christians themselves from thinking about religion having a role for critiquing the political structures, for being able to sit in judgment of them. And that's one that the former Archbishop of Canterbury and very esteemed theologian Rowan Williams has argued about Harnack, was that this turning it into this very simple faith that every believer can hold inside, this brotherhood of man, this fatherhood of God, this spiritual community you might be a part of, makes them unprepared to stand up to state power, makes them unprepared to be able to push back against it. So the concern of particularly the generation of students who came after Harnack, probably most famously the Swiss theologian Karl Barth, he reacted very strongly to this generation of of basically becoming this just like interior spiritual presence for whatever political regime was in place, and such that the a lot of people were a lot of leaders in the church as well as in the academy were kind of primed to be able to make peace with the Nazis to some extent, because they were going to manage the outside stuff, all the politics, and we were going to manage the interior spiritual state.
We'll do our
And
thing, you do yours, basically.
exactly. And that division was one that was quite obviously very disastrous for Germany as a whole, but most particularly for its Jewish community.
I mean, there were some people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer who did stand up, but and obviously paid the ultimate price.
Bonhoeffer, grows up down the street from Harnack. He's a part of this. The Bonhoeffer house there, the Harnack house doesn't stand. They put a kind of a motorway, a large motorway, where the Harnack house used to stand. And the Bonhoeffer house, the Max Planck house, and the Harnack house were all on one street there. And Bonhoeffer grew up in this world, and he actually gave the student memorial to Harnack at Harnack's funeral. And so they were very much, he was very much tied into that. I think Harnack would have been a much more like grander figure and wouldn't have ever looked, because of German hierarchy being a serious thing. Particularly in the academy, he would never seen like Dietrich Bonhoeffer as his colleague, but he definitely, was one of the people he respected the most in the younger generation. And Bonhoeffer paid a price for this, as did one of Harnack's sons, also was a part of it. And so this younger generation, they definitely still saw Harnack as someone who taught them something, but they definitely felt as though there was something deeply inadequate about the system of religion that Harnack handed on to them, and one that wasn't prepared to push back against Staatspotence from state power, and that got very vicious in the 30s.
Well, let's pivot our remaining time to what you're doing now, because you are just at this fascinating intersection of artificial intelligence, Protestant theology, Catholic theology. You're the CEO of an AI company. You're the author of one, almost two. It's coming out in December, books on theology. And there have been a lot of analogies made. Is America or current society like, I've heard some people say it's like the 20s or 30s. Some people say it's like Imperial Germany. But spiritually, like, where are we right now? Because it seems that in current American society, and we've discussed this in earlier offline conversations, everyone knows Max Weber, the Protestant work ethic. And it seems that right now, among some of the pillars of American society, like academia and business and whatnot, there's this emphasis on politics and work. And where is that leading us now? I mean, there seems to be a precariousness spiritually and economically at even elite level society. I mean, we already know it's spread through working and middle class society. Can you talk about this sort of spiritual problem we're dealing with now? I mean, also Byung-Chun Han's written about this, regarding the Achievement Society. Where do you see all this right now from your own perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, I see this from a very like particular vantage point here. In my academic appointment at Harvard, I've been kind of leading the research on social connectedness and belonging at the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, where we've been looking at the decline of kind of social relations and social connectivity and the rise of social isolation and loneliness. What I think that we've seen, particularly in the research that we've done, a lot of empirical studies as well as some qualitative work, it's best articulated as some form of spiritual crisis that America has right now. What I mean by that isn't that people have like gone on to being like heterodox Christians, or the crisis necessarily being that they no longer are religiously affiliated, or they believe thing, or they don't believe in God. Those have always been more or less true of of most ages of religious belief, at least the kind of post-axial age religious belief, when the large religious traditions started to emerge. But what I mean by that, of people kind of finding coherent structures to understand meaning and purpose, and also finding those places of belonging there. And that's what we're kind of seeing right now, really collapsing. Sometimes they've been referred to as kind of third places or civic organizations that you might go and attend. It's not work, it's not home, it's this other place where you combine with others. And the decline of that has been really serious. Bob Putnam, a very well-known author here at Harvard, famously wrote and published around the turn of millennium, Bowling Alone, which really anticipated a lot of what we're now seeing as a much more general phenomenon. I think at that point, when he was doing that work in the 90s, we were still more or less running on the exhaust of a generation that was very civically engaged, one that still took religious involvement as kind of somewhat normative. They might not, I think a lot of us have older, kind of family members who were, they attended their synagogue, their church regularly without necessarily believing it. And that was a feature, and that's always been a feature of American religiosity there. And what we kind of start to see in the 2000s, and it really starts to come unraveled in the later years of the first decade of this millennium, and kind of accelerates, is people not only just not saying we don't believe it, but just not attending altogether, and then staying home to such a point now that last year there was a survey that was taken, and the majority of Americans said they did not have a friend. To me, that's probably the most frightening existential risk we have in front of us. Things like climate change, and perhaps if we think that artificial intelligence might possibly take over, those are things that they're within our capacity to tackle and change. But they're within our capacity to tackle and change if we're able to do it together. If we're able to relate, if we're able to combine our resources, if we're able to continue our sociality. None of those things that we worry about that are on the front pages of our newspapers is really possible without these thick webs of social belonging and social connection there. And so, but you mentioned something about people finding solace in politics and work. I think those are indicative of people trying to find meaning, trying to find community. From this vantage point, it is not surprising that some of the people in America who've been most vulnerable to kind of being left out and are least likely to attend church right now, to hold kind of steady jobs, are a lot of people who are showing up also at Trump rallies. And there's kind of a misunderstanding at times, I think, from people who look at the Trump phenomenon and think that it's driven by a kind of conservative religiosity, that actually the Trump phenomenon is relatively a-religious. And it's also its own type of religion itself. And so you have people who maybe affiliate or culturally affiliating with evangelicalism, but they aren't themselves those people who go regularly. And that's been a very interesting trend to kind of start to see, because Trump has been around long enough to have pretty significant social research around the phenomenon. And work is another one. And work is kind of like the elite liberals form of it right now. If politics is kind of what's happening for those kind of struggling on the margins of society, those who are kind of are paragons. Those who are our elite performers are finding meaning and purpose at work. That's not a bad thing. And you mentioned the name of Weber, that there's been this tradition within America of like finding salvation through your work. But Weber still thought that, and when in his famous study, he still thought that there was going to be this general society that provided a lot of the important relationships, important goals, and norms that you would take into it. Whereas in today's, I guess, if we might use the term that's often just a term of use, but like liberal elite, it's like the workplace is kind of the place where you achieve, the place where you find belonging, the place where you find importance, and increasingly taking more and more of our lives to an extent that it's normal for people to spend 70, 80 hours at work right now. And that is spilling over into now people of our generation realizing that parenting is seemingly impossible when you're doing this. But in these pockets of liberal elites, we don't really find cultural value in parenting. We find it in our identities of our work and our professional accomplishments.
Yeah, I guess on one hand, there's salvation through work, but it's also we are status-oriented creatures. And it is sort of a strange irony that these universities, most of the elite ones, were founded to train clergy. There's now this new sort of religion of salvation. Let me ask you this, like, where are we? And you talk about this need for social connection, but what about sort of our interior lives, and how resistant are we now to, having the Bonhoeffers of the world pushing back? I mean, are we really vulnerable to some sort of slide because we are sort of hollowed out and we don't have these connections?
I mean, I do think this is like something that we need to pay more attention to, not just because religion in itself is perhaps a good for many, but that it's indicative of a way of appreciating the immaterial goods of our lives in some sense, as well as giving us some sense of values and perspectives that exist outside of those popular sentiments and trends and fashions that kind of overwhelm us at times. And that if all we have are the resources handed to us by dominant culture, we don't have anything to judge it by. And having some way to judge it, to call it into account, is really important. But the outside perspective can be wrong as well. This is not to say the outside perspective is always going to be right, but the outside perspective, it's always important to have that. And it's not just important to have, particularly in democracies, to have some form of pluralism at each point in time to make sure it doesn't ossify into some kind of single party authoritarianism. But within ourselves, always being able to look on what my work is telling me is my value, what the politicians and those people on TV are telling me are my value. Do I have any resources to evaluate whether they're right or wrong? And I think to some extent, the way that we do that is through talking to each other about really meaningful things. And one of the places you do that is in religious community. Other places are other civic institutions. And finding a way for someone else to sit alongside you and look at something together and say, I don't think that's right. That's really important to be able to do, and a missing piece of it. And if you take this to the extreme, this isolation, and this has become increasingly clear in a lot of the psychological studies, is that when you don't have someone else around you, the world in a sense starts to melt away. And there's these fascinating and frightening studies of people who have been in solitary confinement, that they can't make assessments. They don't really know what's true or not. And to some extent, they even report like the walls melting. Like our appreciation of our world requires others to look at it with us. And when we don't have those relationships to look at it and start to talk about what's more meaningful, a lot of things will start to melt away. And our democratic society and everything that we have worked really hard and it's never been perfect to do will be at risk without having others to look on to this with you.
No, that's a really profound and beautiful point. My own experience, I think there's also a lack of transcendence because social media has sort of flattened everything. And you have, a lot of current philosophy now that basically reduces everything to its utilitarian or power structures. And I think that, like, you go to Chartres Cathedral and I hope that there's still that sense of awe. I mean, Henry Adams found that when he was himself similarly disillusioned with industrial America. And, he just really just turned to medieval Europe and he saw Chartres and Mont Saint Michel as these exquisite exemplars of medieval society. They're just awe inspiring. But then you have Le Corbusier, fast forward to the 1930s and 40s, who has had such a profound influence on our architecture. We see it whether it's in housing developments or, unfortunately, in my opinion, university campuses, where he basically says a Gothic cathedral is just ugly. It is ugly. It needs to be, I have no interest in saving it because it is ugly and it is useless and get rid of it. It's not utilitarian. And that's a very, look, I think Le Corbusier made some beautiful buildings. I think his villas are particularly exquisite, but that's a very dark, desolate, cold way to see the world. But I did have some faith during the eclipse where I was on a bus through Midtown Manhattan, which is one of the most capitalistic, self-involved parts of the world. And I was on this bus, the eclipse was going on. I had gotten out of a meeting and put on glasses, and I'm on the bus, and I see everyone, actually, this took place right near St. Patrick's Cathedral, going up Madison Avenue, everyone stopping what they were doing, putting on glasses and looking. I'm like, okay, there is some awe and transcendence in this world after all. So, well, Jonathan Teubner, thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful discussion. And on just one final short question, do you have hope for America and our society? I mean, you're really at the center of this.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for having me on. This has been a really fun conversation. And there's very few occasions to really talk at such breadth about, things from Harnack to our contemporary social crisis here. But yeah, I do have hope for those very reasons that the people are going outside and experiencing transcendence together. Also that even though I'm concerned about it being decadent forms, that people are still like going to find those places of belonging. It's whether it's in politics or in work, it's suggestive of there's a real hunger. I think what the hope is that, and this really is kind of a hope in the full sense of the word, is that I hope that there's still people who are innovating socially to find those places for them. And that one thing about American society is that we innovate in our institutions a lot. And I hope that remains true for us. And if that's the case, if we can continue to innovate within our institutions, I think that we do. But we can bring these people back from thinking about their sense of meaning and purpose is only held up in some political movement, or on the other side, something work that they can find it in other places. And I think the students that I interact with at Harvard are inspiring in this direction. They are finding new ways, even though there are some also troubling trends. But that's what it means to be American.
Jonathan Teubner, thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephen. This was great fun.
This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Thank you for listening. You can expect new episodes every week. To subscribe to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast, visit steveujifusa.substack.com.